Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. And I'm pleased and honored to be interviewing Simon Blackburn. Hello, Simon.
Hello, David.
You are the Bertram Russell Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Trinity College. You are educated in the moral sciences, among other things. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you are the author of many books, including Being Good, Lust, Truth, a Guide,
Yes.
How to Read Hume,
Yes.
The Big Questions, Philosophy, and your most recent book, Practical Tortoise Raising and Other Philosophical Essays, not to be found in the pet section.
That's right. Yes, that's what I hope, anyhow.
And we have decided to do a series of interviews on morality from an evolutionary perspective. And the reason that I approached you to be the first person interviewed is because I think it's important to set the stage broadly and to get an understanding of what morality is in general terms without reference to evolution before seeing what evolution has to do with it. And of course, with your wonderful background, you're capable of doing this. And you also have become interested in morality from an evolutionary perspective yourself. So that's why it's so great to be able to start with you. So I'm going to toss you some impossibly large questions and
Sure.
hope for some concise answers to get us going. My first question, what is morality?
Well, I think at its simplest, it's a system whereby we put pressure on ourselves and others to conform to certain kinds of behavior. And that's the side of morality which is perhaps most obvious. It's associated with rules, with boundaries to conduct, with at the limit criminal behavior when those rules are transgressed. On top of that, there's an element of morality in which it's concerned more with our sentiments and emotions. For example, with sympathy and our capacity to feel sympathy for each other's distress and a corresponding motivation to do something about it. So there are two sides of morality. One of them, perhaps the second one, rather more kind of what should I say, gentle or humane. The other one, slightly more coercive and more to do with rules and with social institutions designed to enforce those rules. So I'd separate those two elements. I don't think they're, I think for analytic purposes it's useful to separate them. In many contexts, they kind of merge into one another. So, for example, our sympathy with the distress of somebody who's been bullied might translate into a belief that the bullies have transgressed social norms and a desire to punish them or alleviate the distress in some way. So I think they go together, but at the same time I think it's worth separating those two angles or two aspects of the thing.
Now, is it safe to say that both are oriented towards the welfare of others in a society as a whole, so that there's something about morality that is inherently other and society-oriented? Is that a safe statement?
I think that is a safe statement. I mean, it's clear that we're social animals. Everybody starts from that premise, I think. It's very, very difficult to say what we'd be like if we were solitary. The fantasy of a Robinson Crusoe is not often realized. And so we grow into a social world, and as we grow into the social world, we also grow into understanding the norms of behavior, just as we grow into a mother tongue. And in fact, in some respects, as we grow into our mother tongue, we also grow into learning, for example, that it's a bad thing to be called various names, a good thing to be called by other various names. So we gain our knowledge of virtue and vice as we grow into our mother tongue, I think.
So if somebody is behaving in an obviously self-serving fashion at harm to others, or on the sentiment side, basically does not respond emotionally to the plight of others, then we're unlikely to call that moral, right?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, these people are often thought of, I mean, at the limit, you've got full-blooded psychopaths. Perhaps somewhere on that spectrum you may have autism and higher functioning, Asperger's and so on. But when people are deficient in their capacity to feel for others, deficient in sympathy, deficient in the emotions connected with other people's expression of emotion, then we do doubt their capacity for a full moral agency.
Right, and yet there's some situations, and philosophers love to invent them, in which are protective of the individual against the group. So famous examples like the lottery example. What's wrong with carving up a healthy individual and
Sure.
giving an organ to saving many lives for one life? So just briefly, of course, we're covering enormous territory. So how does that fit into the scheme that sometimes some things for the good of the group,
Right.
we don't do them? Those are immoral.
Right. That's right. I mean, and this may be partially a historical development, but certainly we in the West at the present day are quite keen on the rights of the individual against the group. We know that those rights often have to give way. For example, property rights might give way when a government wants to, well, we call it in England compulsory purchase order. I think in the United States you've got a different term for it, but a government can override somebody's property rights. We don't allow the government to override your rights in your, as it were, bodily integrity.
Right.
A government can't decide to take one of your organs against your will, even if it would save 5 other people or whatever the thought experiment suggests. So we don't allow that, and we don't allow people to freely enter into contracts which would involve them selling or in some way destroying their bodily integrity.
So somehow this has to be consistent with the more general definition of morality as other and society oriented. And I think it can be, but it's an interesting sort of set of issues that...
It is indeed an interesting set of issues, yeah. And morality is clearly largely about our group behavior, our social behaviors. But on the other hand, society doesn't steamroller us. It's not allowed to steamroller us. We try to protect our individual rights against the encroachments of the society.
And of course, there would be a lot of cultural variation in just that. So, including historical variation. So
absolutely, yes. I mean, if you grew up in Sparta, I think, for example, you didn't have very many rights against the society. If the society said, go out there and lose your life in battle, that's what you jolly well had to do, and the social pressure to conform would be enormous.
Right. Okay. So then, how has morality been approached by philosophers? And let's get some major terms on the table, such as utilitarianism and the deontological approach.
Okay. Well, philosophers like to find system if they can, and those two approaches are approaches which have been designed to try and make system out of what can look like a jumble of social conventions, social norms, different things that matter to us. For example, liberty, equality, welfare, they all jumble together in a lot of political and moral discourse, and so the hunt is on to find some kind of system. Now, the two you mention, utilitarianism, usually associated with the name of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, writing at the beginning of the 19th century, and their line was that it was the greatest happiness, the famous phrase is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and the idea is that you measure your actions and your rules and your social institutions by quantifying the effect they have on the happiness of the people they affect.
And let's just take note here that the metric is happiness.
The metric there is happiness.
Because that's going to come back to us when we start to think about this from an evolutionary perspective. Why should the metric be happiness is one issue that we're going to...
Good indeed, yes, absolutely. But that was the metric. Of course, different conceptions of happiness rapidly started to jostle against each other. There's an old conception, much older than Bentham and Mill, due to Aristotle, in which happiness has to do with flourishing. And that includes exercising abilities,
right,
living a fully human life, all kinds of, possibly having children, indeed, if we bring in a bit of evolution. But Mill and Bentham had, I think, a rather more simplistic view, and Mill officially identifies happiness with pleasure, and so it becomes a rather subjective state, a measurement of your own kind of how far you are up the scale from depression to euphoria.
Right.
So that was utilitarianism. The rival, often in many moral philosophers' minds, the rival to utilitarianism has always been deontology. And a deontological theory says, no, consequences are all very well. We like actions with good consequences, that's fine. But there are duties and rights, and the entry point for morality shouldn't be thinking about the consequences of our actions. The entry point should be the principles underlying our actions, the integrity, the justice, the way in which we can defend our actions as generally the right thing to do. And the name that's usually trotted out in connection with that is, of course, Immanuel Kant, with the famous categorical imperative: you must never act unless you can will that the principle of your action should become a maxim that governs everybody's actions, or a general law, as he called it. And an awful lot of moral philosophy is consisted in people arguing about which has priority, utility or something like this Kantian principle.
Right. Now, you said, are there other alternatives? Those are the two big ones, but are there others?
Well, there are mixed theories, quite popular. John Stuart Mill himself actually had some sympathy with the mixed theory, trying to, for example, advocate a kind of utilitarianism which didn't simply measure individual actions as good or bad according as their effects on welfare were measured, but which measured rules. So you could then start to defend a Kantian rule as a rule which, if it's generally followed, if it's implemented in a society, would in fact have the best consequences for welfare. Because
okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that seems to me reasonable. In my own amateur's opinion, the categorical imperative, there just seems something. It seems that it should be more consistent with utilitarianism, certainly from an evolutionary perspective. Interesting to know that Mill thought that himself.
Yes, Mill certainly, he didn't conceive of himself as, setting up stall in direct opposition to Kant at all. He thought Kant was somebody we could all learn from. And it was this, partly the predictability and the egalitarianism in Kant's view, because one of the nice things about the categorical imperatives is it stops you from making an exception in your own case.
Right.
And we'd all like to make exceptions in our own case if we feel, paying taxes is burdensome. It would be very nice not to.
And let's fast forward and just say a little bit about John Rawls' theory of justice, because he has something which is a little bit like the categorical imperative with the veil of ignorance. Can you just get that on the table for us?
Yes, sure. Yes, Rawls, who of course owed a lot to Kant, he thought of himself as a Kantian. He was interested more, in a sense, in political institutions and the kind of constitution that a society needed in order for its citizens to flourish. So he's as much a political philosopher as a moral philosopher. However, the way he sets about this is very Kantian and very interesting. He says, well, let's look at different societies. Suppose you've got a shopping basket of constitutions. How are you going to choose which society is the right one? Well, let's bring down a veil of ignorance. The idea is you don't know where you're going to be. You don't know whether you're going to be talented and intelligent and a college professor, or not very talented, not very skilled. You're going to be
a college professor.
And the college professor, or whatever it might be. So you don't know the status you're going to occupy in this society. If we really draw the veil very thickly, you might not know the gender you're going to be, you might not know whether you're old or young or whatever. So once the veil of ignorance comes down, then if you've got to choose a constitution, Rawls thinks you've got to choose a just one, because justice is going to be necessary to you. Or, the people at the top of the heap in our late capitalist societies can, as it were, afford to ignore justice. They're not going to need to be bothered about it. But if you don't know where you're going to be, it's going to be very important. So it's a version of the old idea that if we want a fair division of the cake, somebody divides it, but the other person chooses which piece he then gets.
It's interesting that it should all boil down to a convention among families.
That's right, it does. And of course, Rawls thought you could solve this problem about which constitution you should take. It had to be one which he thought guaranteed, first of all, quite a lot of fundamental liberties, as in the American Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but various freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of religious expression, and so on. But then also had a kind of social welfareist element, which was that the way rewards should be allocated within the society should be such as to maximize the position of the least well-off. Right. So it's sometimes called a maxi-min solution. Right. And he argues for this very persuasively to some people, not quite so persuasively to others, across his very big book, The Theory of Justice.
Well, let's get two other major concepts on the table, the naturalistic fallacy and the is-ought problem, so we can, let me have you give a little mini lecture on those.
Sure. Yeah, I think is-ought is probably the easier one to start with, so if I may start with that. This is often associated with David Hume, and Hume said that in every work that he'd read, the author goes on making remarks about human life and so on, and that what is the case, but then suddenly, insensibly, you find that they're talking about what ought to be the case. Now, contrary to what some people think, Hume didn't think that was a mistake or anything like that. He just thought that it wasn't an exercise of pure logic which got you from the one to the other. To get the transition from is to ought, you had basically to deploy your feelings about things. So attitudes, emotions, practical stances, as it were, lubricate that transition. You can't do it by logic. There's no mathematics or no kind of pure theorem of rational choice or rationality at all, which would get you, for example, from X is employed in killing his family to X is doing something wrong. We might all think X is doing something wrong if X is employed in killing his family, but that's because, of course, we have a very strong aversion to that kind of behavior, and that aversion is what Hume would have called a passion. So Hume was one of the first.
Well, it could have also been a duty, right? In a more of a Kantian sense, it could have been. It wouldn't have to be a passion, but what it is a moral predicate, right?
Yeah, that's right. Indeed, I mean, until we know more about the situation, we might not want to make any judgment. But the transition from is to ought will have to be made if we are going to come down with an ought judgment, a judgment that the chap is doing what he ought not to be doing. And somewhere in that transition, you're going to have to deploy an attitude or an emotion, what, as I say, Hume would have called a passion. Other writers sometimes called it a sentiment. And that was a big sort of, well, not quite an earthquake, but Hume thought it was a pretty radical thing to say. He very much enjoyed, as a young man, he was quite subversive and iconoclastic, and he very much enjoyed that this was turning Plato on Plato's head, because for Plato and Platonists, reason rules the roost, reason rules everything. The passions are the unruly horses that pull the chariot every which way, and reason is the charioteer who stands up there and steers them and guides them. And Hume is completely subverting that. He's saying, no, reason tells you the situation you're in, but your passions are the things which finally issue in the commands to go one way or the other, and the choices to behave, and what to do about any situation, and how to judge it. So that was a reversal of the Platonic priorities.
Oh, there's a lot more to say about there, because the passions, just to use the word, is not the same as morality. Now, morality is ought. I mean, ought is a good catchword for morality, right? And yes, something emotional, sentiment-like is involved in morality, but it's quite a tangle to...
Yes. Well, of course, in order to protect his analysis, Hume had to involve what he called a category of the calm passions. And he liked the idea that a lot of passions don't have what you might call an emotional phenomenology. They don't raise our temperatures. They don't make our faces go red. They don't have us thumping the table. And of course, morality doesn't always either. Morality can have a very emotional face, as when we seriously feel insulted or we resent something, we feel indignation. We get hot under the collar, as we say.
Right.
But of course, you can moralize about things without getting hot under the collar, and that's one of the curious aspects of the business.
Okay, well, this is a lot of fun for me, by the way, and so I got 3 more questions before we get to four, where we get to before we get to evolution. Number 1, what is the relationship between morality and religion?
Well, I'll give you my own private take, my own personal take on it. This is going to be controversial. I think most of what I've said so far, I hope, is fairly uncontroversial. But I think I agree with the analysis of Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, writing exactly a century ago, actually, in his great book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He thought that with religion, the society set aside certain things as sacred. The big opposing categories are the sacred and the profane. It taught people the kind of rituals that surround the sacred things, and if a religion is firmly embedded in the life of a society, then it inducts its children and its growing up young adolescents and so on into the place of the sacred in its life. The point of this rather bizarre-seeming activity is to cement the power of the collective, the power of the society, against the private interests of the individual. It's to show the individual, as it were, that he or she must eventually knuckle under to the demands of the social group. So its function, and the reason why religions are prevalent across the world practically, is social cement, social glue, social authority. It's giving people the, as it were, obedience to certain forms. In order to fill that purpose, you don't need a god, you don't need the supernatural, you don't need a lot of theological doctrine, and some religions don't have those things. There are religions without personal gods, like Buddhism, Jain, that version of Hinduism in India. You can have just the sacred site or the sacred objects, the sacred texts. You can have shamans, people especially empowered to interpret those sacred texts. I often think the way I sometimes tell students about this is it's a bit like, if you know that Monty Python, that wonderful film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's a particularly absurd scene when the knights are charging around and they define themselves, as it were, as we are the knights who say ni. Now, of course, it's completely fantastical, but it works in the same. I mean, you can recognize it as a social gluing mechanism. It's like wearing your team's colors. It's like having a private slang, or like kids do at school and so on, because it enables you to identify who's an insider and who's an outsider. So in that sense, it puts a boundary around the society, and it firmly keeps you in it and other people out of it. So it's got a there we are. So it's got a very definite social function, according to Durkheim, and I think that's the best explanation of religion I know. Now, of course, a morality is essentially going to be something where the collective is going to, as it were, flex its muscles against the individual, or it's going to show the individual that it can flex its muscles against the individual.
So religion sort of implements morality for a group, but I recall Bernard Williams, I think, the philosopher Bernard Williams, saying
Sure.
that it sort of implements morality, but morality does not come from the gods, and that if you were to have a situation where a god told you to do something that you considered to be immoral, in some sense, so much the worse for the gods. Could you kind of go into that a little bit?
Oh, yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think the most dramatic claim of that form is made by Kant, where Kant says even the Holy One of the Gospels can only be judged to be good by you deploying your own judgment.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's amazing. Okay, number two, what's the relationship between altruism and morality? Because I think those are often equated, especially in the evolutionary literature. And
Sure.
I think that we both agree that there's more to morality than altruism. So where does altruism fit, and what goes beyond altruism?
Right. Well, altruism is, I suppose a biologist would define it in terms of being prepared to reduce your own fitness in order to provide a benefit for another conspecific. I'm not sure, we might get back to this because, of course, our own fitness in the biological sense is not one of our central concerns very often. Our own pleasures and our own day-to-day concerns are much more on our minds a lot of the time than, for example, our capacity to breed. And many of us willfully destroy our capacity to breed by going off and doing drugs and alcohol and things. So one's got to be careful here. I would say, if altruism is simply a concern for the well-being of other people, simply in and of itself, that is, regardless of any reciprocal good they might do to you, or regardless of some kind of long-term strategic plan you've got for getting your own benefit out of it, for example, by showing to other people that you're a good chap or something. So if it's simply a disinterested concern for the good of others, I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm glad our species is capable of showing it. I'm not sure it's all that common, and I think it needs encouragement and practice. That is, we are very good at passing by on the other side, which is why a lot of moralities, they have their stories about people who've done good for others and so on. It's much more prominent, of course, in the Christian tradition than it ever was in, say, the pagan, the classical world. I think the story of the Good Samaritan would probably have made rather little sense to Aristotle or Plato. The arrival of, as it were, altruism as a kind of duty, I think was probably typical of the change from paganism to Christianity, it's become a more prominent feature of how we think of morality because of that. In the pagan world, for example, a virtue like courage would have been much more prominent. Courage or loyalty would have been much more prominent than altruism. The idea that morality...
I've been actually dying to ask this question. The word altruism wasn't coined until the 1800s by Auguste Comte, right? And
I think that's right.
There was a time in which the word altruism didn't exist. And do you know what the context was in which he coined that word?
No, I don't. Is there a story about it?
No, I want to know, but it always strikes me as curious. It's such an important word for us today.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting me to imagine a time, not too far back,
right,
in which, the word didn't exist. Presumably the topic was discussed, but what were the words that were used, and why was it necessary for him to coin a new word? I really want to know the answer to that question.
I think that's a very good question, David, and I wish I knew the answer off the top of my head. I think the first thing I'd look at is what date it arrived. Do you have a date in your head? If it arrived before or after the origin of species, that might be an interesting...
Well, I'll look into it. That'll be another separate topic. Now,
sure.
Richard Joyce, in his book on the evolution of morality, makes the point that if we were all just spontaneously altruistic, for example, nepotistic, if we're all just instinctively inclined to benefit our relatives, that's not really getting at human morality.
Right.
And that what does get at human morality is the concept of moral obligation. Is that and so that's a little bit different than altruism, because with moral obligation, you've got to do this stuff that we're calling moral, right?
Well, I think that's right. I would agree with Richard about that, and it harks back to what I said right at the beginning, that morality has two kind of aspects. One is the rules, obligations, permissions, transgressions, the kind of quasi-legal side of it. And the other is the just promoting the good, the rather more gentle side. Right. Altruism is to do with promoting other people's good, obviously, and we like it when people are like that. But of course, there are very few enforcements. It's very difficult. In fact, I don't think there's any enforcement in any legal system known to me of just pure altruism.
Right.
Very strenuous moralists, Peter Singer's probably the most famous contemporary example, kind of like the idea that you should somehow feel obligated to be maximally altruistic. You spray your money around the poor of the world. Giving to charity is the biggest possible sort of good in his view. And unfortunately, that's not the way we are. And it's certainly not the way we organize our social prohibitions and laws.
Okay, well, next is the distinction between action and intention, because obviously, in some sense, morality must be reflected in what we do, but evidently, in the minds of many people, that is merely necessary and not sufficient for something to count as moral. So help us out with that one.
Right. Well, at its easiest, it's that we look very differently at people if they've done something unintentionally than if they've done it intentionally. If you're in a crowded bus, somebody treads on your foot, they apologize, they get off, it was an accident, that's okay, that's fine. If somebody treads on your foot intentionally, you'd have a very different attitude to them. So, and the law, of course, embodies this in the demand of mens rea. The mind has to be set on the act. In other words, if a tin of baked beans accidentally falls in my shopping basket, I'm not a shoplifter. But if I put it there intentionally and didn't pay for it, then I am. So both the criminal law and I think ordinary moral thinking very much requires intention in order for the full kind of weight of moralizing or the weight of the law to come down on the agent. That's the first thing. It's not absolute. There are cases of crimes, of course, where absence of intention doesn't actually sway things. Just as there are cases of negligence, for example. Negligence, recklessness can count as criminal. You don't intend, the teenager charging around the neighborhood unsafely in a car may not even have intended to drive unsafely. He wasn't aware he was driving unsafely, but he's still clobbered if he's an unsafe driver. You think badly of him and the law thinks badly of him.
Well then, I'll continue.
So it's not an absolute. It's not as if intention is a necessary condition of behaving badly, but it's certainly a large part of it. It's only when somebody's acting intentionally that we tend to moralize. And I think that the reason is, and David Hume is right here, I think, that it's when somebody is acting intentionally that the action expresses his character, his or her settled disposition to actions of a certain kind.
Okay, so you're concerned about how they're going to behave in the future.
Exactly.
And intentions help you with that, but the actual act of the moment doesn't.
Intentions help with that, and our folk theory tells us that our techniques for changing people's behavior by, say, anger, showing resentment, showing displeasure, and if necessary, showing that in a socially embodied way, as with the criminal law, that those technologies work on intentions. They're designed to make you shy off from that kind of behavior in the future. Whereas if you did something accidentally, we don't have a technology for stopping accidents, at least not the same one by means of persuasion and by showing our anger or resentment.
So what about distinctions such as, let's take someone who's as good as gold, they always intend the best, always will, but then we discover that what motivates them is the desire to get to heaven. And
right.
Does that somehow count as less moral than some other reason for that kind of...
This is, you probably need to ask somebody more religious than me about this, but certainly from the outside.
Well, we can take the religion out of it. It could be like, for example, because it makes them feel good.
Right.
As opposed to, so that it ends up in some sense being selfish in some sense.
We've got to be careful about this because, of course, you're absolutely right that if you've internalized a moral code, that does mean that you'll feel bad about transgressing it, and you'll feel good about conforming to it. It's become part of your motivational structure. I don't like the inference from that to saying, so it's selfish, really.
Right. But some people make that inference, right?
Some people do, and I think it's a mistake, because there's all the difference in the world between somebody who is overtly selfish. I mean, that is, they grab for themselves and they don't share and so on. And somebody who, say, does share and does good for other people and so on. And if you say, oh, well, it's just it makes him feel good, I think the right reply is, yes, well, I wish everybody was made to feel good like that, because
exactly.
that's virtue. I think it's rather different when you look at the Christian or the religious explicit introduction of a motive of self-interest. So there you're supposed to give your, I don't know, say, suppose you give a tenth of your money to the poor because you'll get to heaven. And that's, as it were, an explicit, naked appeal to self-interest.
Right.
And I think that's a pity, and Kant is very strong on this. This distorts the morality. It might work, but then you've got somebody who's, as it were, basically looking after himself, whereas you're supposed to be looking after the other person.
Right.
That's the distortion. Similarly, Kant thought, for example, if I suppose I'm honest, I would shy away from telling a lie in all except the most disastrous circumstances. That's it. I'm just supposed to think it's a lie. I won't tell it. I'm not going to go that way.
Yeah.
Whereas if I think it's a lie, well, I might get on the wrong side of God if I tell it. But maybe there's room for repentance later. And it's God of mercy. I'll probably get away with it. That's not the way he should be thinking.
As the bumper sticker says, Jesus is coming, act busy.
Yeah, that's right, exactly, yes.
Okay, so final question before we get to evolution. The role of intuition in moral reasoning, because it seems to me that often when philosophers or other people think about morality, they're relying very heavily on something that just seems moral to them. The base of authority is intuition, and of course that runs the risk of being culturally provincial. So there's a presumption there that my intuition is everyone's intuition.
Sure.
So tell us about that a little bit.
Well, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, I don't like the word intuition very much. It usually just means the first thought that comes into your head or the first idea that seems to you a good one to stick with. And, of course, an awful lot of philosophy in other areas than this, too, consists in worrying about the authority of intuitions. There are clearly areas where they have more authority than others. Elementary arithmetic is the most obvious example. How do we know that 2 + 2 = 4? Well, we don't know how we know it, but intuition just christens it. I mean, the two systematizers I talked about, John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant, are both motivated, I think, by the desire to have something less parochial, less subject to cultural fluctuation and of course less susceptible of dispute, that they could put in the place of a sort of jumble of intuitions. And they mistrusted intuition. They wanted this, in Mill's case, the principle of utility, in Kant's case, the categorical imperative, to appeal to people just as the deliverances of, in effect, reason. And they would take over. They would then render unnecessary appeal to a sort of unsystematic jumble of intuitions. So that was a motivation for these people, for these guys.
Okay, right. Right, okay, good point. Although Hume would be the exception to that, because Hume would found his on the passions, right? So there's some sense in which in which intuition, insofar as that's emotions, passions, so on, would remain central.
Curiously enough, David, I mean, Hume was a proto-utilitarian. I mentioned that Bentham and Mill are the two that get, landed with that label. He thought that our passions and sentiments certainly lie at the bottom of it, but they have a definite direction. There are certain things which are fitted to excite our passions. And what excites our admiration, Hume thought, was largely the kind of activity which promotes the general good. So, in fact, he's got a system in his theory of the exciting, the stimuli which excite our admiration and for that matter, our dislike. What we dislike, what we have hold in despite or in contempt, are the kinds of actions which tend to decrease the public benefit or the general good. So in fact, Hume is quite close to utilitarians, but he gets there a slightly different way.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful introduction, setting the stage for thinking about morality from an evolutionary perspective. The reason that we're doing a whole series is so that we could explore this in detail, but I get to have more time with you. And so now, so how does evolution come into the picture? I'd like to ask that at two levels. One is historically. So when Darwin's theory was presented, then what were the moral implications seen at the time? And then let's fast forward to the present to see how current day people, philosophers plus more, are actually integrating evolutionary theory into the study of morality. Let's begin with Darwin.
Good. Yes, well, I'm not a 19th century historian by speciality, so I certainly am not familiar with, as it were, the newspaper or the journal kind of reactions to Darwin. But I think we know enough to know the general picture. First of all, people were shocked. Darwin was stripping away our special glory, our separateness from the animals, our completely God-given and different natures, and seeing us as continuous with the animals, and that was deeply shocking and disturbing to many people. And secondly, the whole aspect of nature read in tooth and claw, of course, worried people a great deal. Darwin
himself, if morality somehow doesn't exist, and that morality, there's something so flimsy about it that this is revealing its flimsiness, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or that at best it was some kind of disguise for a brutal war of all against all. It was simply a kind of fig leaf over our real animal natures.
Right.
And of course that idea, I mean, I think it seems very naive to us now, and Darwin did, of course, oppose it, but it did have a lot of currency. I think the kind of, in people's minds, for example, the inevitability of conflict became a kind of axiom of political thought in the late 19th century, and this eventually led to the kind of competition between the great powers that issued in the First World War. So there's a huge kind of, both a kind of fatalism, I think. Well, you can't do without aggression. You're going to get it. You're going to get war. You're going to get conflict. So we better prepare for it. And that took hold of, I think, quite a lot of political thinking and presumably social thinking. People elect politicians in the late 19th century. And of course, that was deeply disturbing to Darwin himself and to Darwinians. So I think the reaction from people like Herbert Spencer and quite a lot of people in the context of political action was probably rather harmful. The other area where I think that exposes itself is in race relations. People found it easy to interpret the difference between the civilized West and the uncivilized African or the tribes in other parts of the world in terms of progress. There was a kind of mistaken, I'm sure you know, of course, kind of mistaken.
Well, it's as if, the theory was viewed through the lens of Victorian culture, and it would be difficult for it to be viewed any other way. So I think that it's an interesting question as to what role the theory played, or what role the overlay of the culture.
Yes, I agree entirely, and of course, racist ideas were just endemic in the world of the time. So it is hard. It's a chicken and egg thing, and this is where I say I'm not really a historian. But I think there's no doubt that there were these somewhat unfortunate public facets of Darwinism, or of what people took from Darwin. Now, he himself, of course, was very careful to say that He thought morality was an excellent thing. He gives the example of two tribes, one of whose members are courageous and loyal, and they're true to each other and true to their word and so on, and amongst themselves peaceable, and it's going to do a lot better than another tribe in which those virtues are not found.
Although it's always been curious to me that he passes over the problem of between-group conflict. It just never kind of, he doesn't even comment on it.
No, that's right. That's right. Yes, it's not a fully worked out position, I don't think. Well, then, of course, coming onto this onto later time, as evolutionary theory started to develop, then again there is the problem, which was, for example, highlighted by Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, of how we're to think of the evolution of altruistic behaviors. If they really are decreasing my fitness in favor of somebody else's, how could a trait, a gene for doing that, possibly have multiplied? And I suppose until quite recently, but you know far more about this than I do, this seemed like a real problem. It seemed very difficult, almost a theorem of biology, that was not going to be possible.
Well, I want to quickly introduce another historical figure, Huxley.
Oh, yes.
Because Huxley differed from Darwin, as you know, and on this point, and Huxley felt that there was no morality at all to be found in nature or evolution, and that the only way for humans to have morality is to teach it and to somehow oppose our animal natures. And I think that introduced a theme, or at least embodied a theme, which is still very much present in some people today.
Sure.
The idea that we have to learn how to be moral. There's no sense in which evolution prepares us to be moral. And yet on the other side, we have people like Frans de Waal, who thinks that very much there's the roots of morality can be found in nature. So there's a divide that has persisted from the beginning of evolutionary theory, represented by Darwin and Kropotkin versus Huxley, and which exists almost unchanged to the present day. And I know that's going to come up in future installments of this.
I'm sure it is, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Kropotkin's a very interesting figure here. He thought that mutual aid was the moral to draw from Darwinism, as it were. The idea that somehow we teach it, but it's not natural, which I think is rather a half-baked idea philosophically.
I don't see it's not sustainable.
Sustainable, exactly. It's there, unfortunately, at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, where he says that we alone amongst animals can rebel against the selfish genes of our birth, which takes some doing, in my view. And it's not so easy to rebel against whatever nature's handed you. So, no, I don't like that idea. It seems to me much more promising to look at either multi-level selection, which is, I think, much more on the table now than it would have been, say, 50 years ago, or even 10 years ago, perhaps, or to look at the general plasticity of our minds. So if you take something like, say, a Prisoner's Dilemma game, is this going too fast for your audience? Or
No. Keep going. Okay. We can flush out, the beauty of this series is that we can flush out the details. So
sure.
The next person is going to review this talk, and so that's going to establish continuity.
Okay, good. I mean, one of the possibly the limitations of game theory, at any rate elementary game theory in its classical form, is that the payoff, the situation, is pretty much a given. It's an exogenous situation. This is the game, you're in it, how are you going to play? One of the things human groups are good at doing is, first of all, of course, changing the payoff matrix. For example, making antisocial behavior much more costly than it would otherwise be, or taking away the rewards of antisocial behavior. Secondly, of course, we choose who gets to play the game, and if you're sufficient of a bad hat, you don't get involved in cooperative endeavors and in potentially fitness-enhancing ways of life. And that's found in animal packs as well, I understand. The so-called canid bow, I think, is a very salient example where pack animals will seriously turn on an animal that misuses a Pacific signal, a signal that it's intending only to play. If it says it intends only to play and then it goes for the other animal, this is regarded as a serious transgression. So there's costs and benefits attached to that kind of behavior. And I think it's very important that society, we keep eyes on each other, very, very pronounced eyes on each other.
Right.
And a lot of behavior is, as we said earlier, I think, David, a lot of it is not a question of trying to enforce or encourage altruism. A lot of it is a question of trying to enforce and encourage obedience to various, very specific norms.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Norms comes in hugely here. And to say just a little bit more about group selection, I think the reason that group selection is so central to this is because, as we began this conversation, there is something about morality that is inherently society and other-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about group selection that inherently explains groups as adaptive units. And so there's a natural fit between group selection and morality. If group selection is something which happens, if it's an important force, then how evolution gets related to morality is going to go one way. If it turns out that group selection just doesn't work at all, and that there's the concept of for the good of the group is just something that just does not work, then the study of evolution morality is going to go another way. So that there's a reason why group selection is right there in the middle in terms of this topic.
I would agree entirely, and of course the work you've done and others is very important here. But I do think that the group comes in, and this almost takes us back to Durkheim. Groups throw their weight about. We acculturate children. We educate them into the ways of our group.
Right.
And a lot of what we're doing is not, I think, even directly encouraging children to think in terms of the good of the group, although if the child becomes a great statesman or something and can show that he or she has done great things for its nation or its group, you get statues erected to it. That's a way of being a very good person, having a good life. But for most people, basically, their duty is to keep to the norms, to keep to the structures and to the prohibitions and the boundaries that the group insists upon.
Right. Yeah. Now, does evolution change the definition of morality?
I would hope not. I tend to see evolutionary theory as, at its best, as so extraordinarily interesting at giving us a picture of how we might have got to be where we are. It's another thing for it to change our conception of where we are. So, for example, it'd be one thing to say for an evolutionary theorist to say, this is how altruism developed. Or this is how, let's take an easier example, this is how mother love developed. I'll give a story about the evolution of mother love, bonding of mothers and infants.
Right.
And so it's another thing to say, oh, it's basically just a mechanism for the efficient passing on of genes, so it's not really mother love at all. It's that final inference which I think needs a great deal of skepticism. I don't think it's impossible that an evolutionary story should lead us to a slightly different conception of where we are. But very often our conception of where we are is pretty well fixed. We know that mothers love their children. And it's another matter whether evolutionary theory can explain that. And no doubt it can, but that's another matter.
Well, another point, another angle on it is that at best, evolution is going to explain how we behave morally in relatively small groups, especially before the advent of agriculture, for example.
Right.
And so evolution equally explains, multi-level selection equally explains how behaviors that a third party would regard as immoral, especially with respect to conflict between groups, in which the members of each group regard themselves as being highly moral in the process of trying to exterminate the other group. So it seems to me that we can kind of stand back from that situation, and we can say that the between group conflict part of that is immoral. It counts as immoral, And the only way we can do that is if the definition of morality stands apart from evolution.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And of course, you are right to notice that, of course, a sort of Achilles heel of group selection isn't that it's going to find it so easy to explain universal benevolence or universal altruism. It might just explain tribal warfare, and that's of course a problem.
We can work as moral agents. We can work to expand the circle of morality, for example.
Yeah.
Even if it's never existed in the past historically, it can still exist in the future.
Sure, certainly. And of course, we've got a lot of, Adam Smith noticed the role of commercial interactions,
right,
in softening intergroup rivalries. When England and France started to trade with each other, it was much better than fighting each other. Right. And that's not a zero-sum game, whereas the fighting is. So, commerce, trade, communication, even things like the internet might do a lot for a more generous sense of universal benevolence or altruism.
Well, does evolution alter the currency of morality? If it doesn't alter the definition, does it alter the currency?
It's certainly, of course, one's got to be careful, as I think we've touched on already, of thinking that evolution predicts, for example, that we're all only concerned to maximize the number of our descendants, or something silly like that.
Right.
It's obvious that human beings aren't like that in all kinds of ways. What evolution's done instead is give us, for example, pleasure in sex. And that's a good enough motive for us to behave in ways which eventually do generate children very often. Evolution has given us a fairly rich and intricate set of motivations. This is where the passions come back, I think. We can be concerned about all kinds of different features of our situation, short-term, long-term, general features, private features, features of things like justice, features like equality, features like fairness of due process, and so on. And similarly, our sense of our own self-worth, our own self-esteem can be attacked in all kinds of ways too. So there are various ways in which people can undermine us, or we can undermine each other. All this gives us a very rich motivational set, a very rich set of attitudes and passions that bundled together seem to make up our moral lives. Very interestingly, when Hume started his analysis of morality, to many people's surprise, he didn't start with a simple sort of notion like, say, benevolence. He started with pride. And pride is a very complicated emotion. We can be proud of all kinds of things. It's something like the imagined approval of other people, which we imagine ourselves to deserve for some trait or another. And if you look at the sources people have of pride, and similarly the sources of resentment if their pride is offended, you find they're very various. They're very, very difficult to categorize, and you can see immediately how difficult it is when you think that with Christianity, pride is the root of all evil. For Aristotle, the great souled man, it's his pride which is, as it were, what keeps him going.
Right.
So there's a huge divergence of possible opinion.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure how I got onto that, but it was basically that there's not going to be a simple motivational repertoire which for evolution just to plug into and say, oh, that's how it came about.
Well, yeah, to say a little bit more about that, one reason why biological reproduction is not the metric that we need is because that's just one mechanism of inheritance. And one thing it means to take cultural evolution seriously is that the concept of cultural fitness is not totally subordinate to the concept of genetic fitness. And if you have a human culture which is very enduring, and it happens that the people within that culture don't have a lot of kids, well, that's irrelevant, basically. It's the culture that's enduring. And
sure.
But I do think that even after we take that into account, there's something about the distinction between proximate and ultimate causation in evolution, which has got to be very relevant to the currency of morality.
Yes, indeed.
And it might be that you already said that there's different versions of utilitarianism, and that some of them emphasize like flourishing more than the surface emotion. And I think that possibly what evolution might do is kind of weight things in favor of a more expansive definition of happiness than just something which is a pure proximate mechanism.
I think that's absolutely right, David, and I hope that does happen. It seems to me that, for example, our ambition to know things, our ambitions to get things right, what Nietzsche called the will to truth, those are very powerful driving forces in people's minds, regardless of direct utility. There may be indirect utility to knowing, for example, the size of the universe, but there's no direct utility to knowing it. And yet it drives a huge number of people's life work. So it's here we get all sorts of different things which people will put into their conception of their own flourishing. What would count as a good thing for me to do over the next 10 years or next lifetime?
Right.
And this has to be taken account of, I think.
Okay, well, does evolution undermine the authority of morality?
No. Here we get into deep philosophical territory, but I'll try and keep it straightforward. Roughly, meta-ethicists, that is, people who worry about the status of ethics, divide into two camps. This is going to be a bit simple, but it's pretty well true. There are those who think of, they're sometimes called realists. They think that ethics is, as it were, a subject matter, like geography. The usual comparison is with mathematics, which is perhaps better. And it's our job to know about it. That, unfortunately, doesn't sit all that well with evolutionary theory, because if ethics is a subject matter with its own structures, its own nature, it's not at all clear that we've adapted to know about it. And so there are people out there who think that, yeah, the comparison with mathematics or geography is good, so we probably don't know the first thing about ethics. We're probably still in the state of sort of childish guessing, because we're not adapted to know about this very odd set of facts. That's realism. Now, I'm, along with other people, perhaps the best known, certainly in the United States, is Alan Gibbard, a very fine moral philosopher at Michigan. I'm notorious for holding a quite different view. I say there's no reality there. With ethics, we do what I described at the beginning as putting pressure on ourselves and other people to conform our behaviors to various patterns. We talk about moral knowledge. That's just fine, and I don't altogether regret that. I'm not an error theorist. I think I know that we've got duties to our children, let's say. But that just means I'm very wedded to that attitude of mine, sufficiently wedded to it that if you don't share it, I'm going to look askance at you, and in the limit I might set the dogs on you. I mean, I might be at war with you. But there's no independent external subject matter here.
But we did say that there's something about morality that evolution does not alter the definition of morality. That morality, in some axiomatic sense, is about the welfare of others and society. To that degree, it is independent of evolution, right?
Yes, what I think evolutionary theory does, as far as this dispute amongst philosophers about the status of morality goes, it helps the side that Alan Gibbard and myself are on, because we think our theory meshes in with a much simpler evolutionary understanding of what morality is and why we're good at it, as good as we are.
As good as we are. And that's only somewhat good, right? That's definitely it's a glass half full, right?
Oh yes, we're not saints. But we do know certain things. We get certain things, and they stand fast for us. They're not things we're going to worry our heads about whether they're true. So, for example, one of them is that it's a bad thing to torture children for fun, and another thing is that we've got duties to the next generation, and so on and so on. So there are unambitious things which are fine. They're fixed in our emotional and eventually our social and legal repertoires. And there's not really a great mystery about them. for the realist, there's a great mystery about the whole of morality. And that's what's wrong with it, I think. If you read Plato's Republic, say, Plato's the arch realist, it becomes completely unclear what he thinks morality is or why we should be interested in it. He thinks that it's going to take 10 years of mathematics and 5 years of philosophy to even begin to know anything about the good. And you think, oh, Christ, if it's that hidden, why do I need it?
Awesome. Okay. Oh, well, I got just a couple more here. One thing that fascinates me about the evolution of human sociality is the idea that in humans, because the human groups were not highly related, members were not highly related to each other, that this kind of egalitarianism evolved. That is an enforced egalitarianism. This is the work of Christopher Boehm and others that will be interviewing them. And what seems so interesting about that is that the only way human groups function as adaptive units, as moral communities, as he puts it, is because they bind each other. And so the moral obligation part of, and also the need to protect individuals, that individuals will not enter into a human social group unless there's kind of protection so that the group doesn't turn on them, that there's something about that whole fabric of human sociality as being protected that sort of fits really well with what we've been saying about morality.
Yeah, I think it fits excellently, yes. I mean, eventually any individual, it may go against the grain, but they've got a constant monitoring possibility of monitoring what they're doing for the group and what the group's doing for them.
Right.
And I think Boehm is absolutely right that the group will need to show eventually, if it's not going to provoke, in effect, revolution, that it's doing something, at least something. Because once you drive people to the state where they say, well, the group's doing nothing for me, I'm opting out. Then,
so evolution can explain sort of the individual rights dimension of morality in addition to the group. And we even have historical examples that in societies that did go too far in the direction of the group having authority over the individual, those societies didn't turn out too well. I mean, that's what Nazi Germany might have been.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, people interested in the downfall of authoritarian or totalitarian groups will, of course, point out the institutional infirmities associated with totalitarian government or the fixed authority of the group. Groups in themselves are not information gatherers. They may be very bad at processing, gathering information and processing it. And this was, of course, the foundation of neoliberal economics. People like Friedrich Hayek pointing out that the market is a much better information gatherer than, the Politburo or the.
That's wonderful for this to slip into economics. That's a whole other conversation.
It certainly is, yeah.
Well, let me finish up with just a couple points. At the very beginning, you said that what moral philosophers like to do is systematize things, to turn a jumble into a system.
Right.
But there's something about evolution that's very jumble-like.
Okay.
And I think that there's some inappropriate, of course, we need to systematize in some sense, but there's also a kind of systematizing which is inappropriate for a product of evolution, which is inherently historically contingent and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And so speak to me a little bit about how evolution might change the way we try to act as systematizers.
Good. I mean, the two I mentioned as systematizers are John Stuart Mill and Kant. I could have gone on to say, of course, that there are a lot of people who think that the whole systematization ambition was mistaken. Bernard Williams, you mentioned earlier, was one. He was very hostile to the idea that you could bring serious system into ethics. And I think evolution would, give an understanding of why that might be so. For example, if you take two different aspects of our moral philosophy, say, take, say, liberty and equality. Which one has priority? which is the more important? Now, we can argue about that, and of course we can make a pitch for our own preference, but one possible way of thinking about it is, well, there's the evolution of a concern for equality of the kind you've just kind of sketched, Christopher Bohm's work. But then there's a profound dislike of being told what to do, so we're quite jealous of our own liberties as well. And they're just, two different modules or two different aspects of our natural emotional makeup. Culture might try to suppress one in favor of the other, or culture might actually render us blind to one as opposed to the other. Perhaps Republicans are blind to the virtue of equality, but maybe they both sit there, and there's never going to be a systematization because they're actually pointing to different aspects of things, each of which has its own importance to us. And I think evolutionary theory would be very hospitable, as I understand it, to that kind of, kludge. It's just we've developed as a
right. And that leads to my final question, which is the universality of morality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some sense in which we'd like to think of morality in universal terms, and also to think in terms of human universals.
Right.
There's something that we can explain that's culturally universal.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it seems to me that when we take cultural evolution seriously, then that actually leads to a different view in which whatever is universal is, in terms of our human psychology, becomes so many building blocks that gets turned into different cultural forms.
Yeah.
And so then we can think about cultural variation in moral systems in a way that, as shocking as it might seem, there's no human universals. That's how important the cultural variation is. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I take it they're human universals in the sense that, it's maybe a very thin sense, but I think in any human society that I've ever read about, and this may not, I'm not an anthropologist either, or historian, there will be sources of shame and pride and guilt. There'll be things that embarrass people. There'll be the desire for privacy, not necessarily, we're very concerned about privacy when we perform our bodily functions. There's societies where that's not true, but they're probably very concerned about privacy in some other area. So I think there's a sort of repertoire there, which I would
I refer to those as the building blocks. So I think that I agree with you on that, basically. Yes,
right.
There are building blocks, but what gets built from them? For example, in some system could be very heavily based on shame, which is a sort of an external.
Yeah.
In other cases, it could be based on internalized, so that you shouldn't require any monitoring because you should all internalize it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that all we can do is look at the various different anthropological data, the historical data, try and assess, the amount of variation, and once more see if we can see any system in it, see if the same building blocks, as it were, are revealed. But of course, you're quite right that the houses we build for ourselves have very different shapes and sizes.
Now, not all moral philosophers are so interested in evolution, right? So, what's the situation now among moral philosophers, and how much people are paying attention to evolution, and what would someone who a colleague of yours in moral philosophy who is not interested in evolution, what would they say? Just to how would you explain their perspective?
Well, philosophers are naturally pretty curious, and there are not many of us, I think, who would just say, "Oh no, I'm not interested in any of that." I think they would have to take their stand on the view that they're interested in where we are now, and not interested in how we got to be here, or not primarily interested in how we got to be here. And certainly those moral philosophers are concerned, I don't know, to argue, say, the rights and wrongs of something or other. There are moral philosophers, like Peter Singer, who I've already mentioned, like Ronnie Dworkin, say, like John Rawls, who are interested in, promoting a certain kind of moral or political or ideological picture of what we should be doing. And provided they can argue that their whatever it is they're promoting isn't actually contrary to human nature, isn't actually impossible for us, then they can say, well, this is an avenue we can take, and I'm arguing that we should take it. And how we got to be the kind of creatures that can take it, that's for the evolutionists or the historians or the cultural people. So there's a division of labor which is sort of respectable. But I think it's more interesting than that. I think I regard evolution and for that matter, the sister science, the knowledge of how our brains seem to be working, which is a major topic of research, of course, now. I think that it behoves the moral philosopher to know as much about the science as he can get hold of, because it's simply no good advocating one or another policy if you find that it's actually contrary to something very deep in us, which is inherited. Of course, that's one view. Another view is, well, we've got to find what the deep inheritances are and root them out if they're very bad.
Well, then there's that's what actually future evolution can be, especially with respect to cultural evolution. The past does not predict the future.
That's right.
When it comes to evolution.
That's right.
Well, this has been a tremendous conversation. I want to express my gratitude because it's a great start to our series. Next person will be viewing this, and so we'll really have a sense of accumulation in terms of how we develop this topic. We will be looking at the neuro side. I'm going to be sure to include Patricia Churchland, for example, if she's willing. And so, thank you so much for sharing this time with us, and just thank you.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure, and I hope your series is a terrific success. I really look forward to seeing some of it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Hello.